Thanks, Ross, and thanks for joining me. Tonight, Anthony Albanese's women issue. I'll show you how his hypocrisy is there for all to see. Political security. How can one nation campaign properly from behind a wall of police protection? I'll talk to the Victorian opposition spokesperson. The Bondi Royal Commission hears police downplay the Opera House disgrace while a pro-Palestinian lawyer attacks Israel. Alex Rivchin will join me. And should the Muslim call to prayer echo across an Australian suburb? All that plus Julian Lisa on Albanese's broken Garma promise and Susie O'Brien and Stephen Senatiempo on the flying kangaroo flying jobs overseas. Let's get into it. The rise of political violence and intimidation is a crucial issue, even for us here in our relatively benign democracy. As you know, we've seen violent political protests here over the years, whether the issue was Vietnam or uranium mining or the early antipathy towards the Howard government with those horrible Parliament House riots. But thankfully, political violence here has never reached the levels seen in other countries like the United States, especially when it comes to targeted attacks against specific individuals. Yet we can't afford to be the slightest bit complacent, especially after the Bondi massacre, the worst act of terrorism in this nation's history, when 15 people were killed just 8 months ago in what police allege was an act of Islamist extremist terrorism. We must be ever vigilant here. And that's why I want to mention what I saw in Melbourne yesterday when I was following Pauline Hanson across a couple of events. When Hanson announced a clutch of new One Nation candidates at a CBD hotel in the morning, the security was overwhelming. Teams of armed police patrolled around the streets outside, and dozens more officers were inside the hotel patrolling the ground floor while the event was being held upstairs. Now, I've been around media and politics for 40 years, and I've seen plenty of incidents and protests and security from all angles. This was an exceptional array of security. It tells me the police in Victoria are operating under the advice of intelligence that details a significant threat. Now, I remember covering Hanson events in the late 1990s, when there were more protesters outside some of her venues than sometimes there were supporters inside. And on occasions, these protests descended into violence back then. That wasn't good, of course, but I'm more worried now. One Nation has become a potent political force across the nation. And late yesterday, I went to Pauline Hanson's second event, a fundraiser at a hotel in Melbourne's Hawthorn. This area was surrounded by police. 2 roads were blocked with traffic diverted right around the hotel. Protesters targeted One Nation and, of course, the people attending.
Off our streets! Racists come! Off our streets! Racists come!
Yeah, and, of course, the main focus of their vitriol was the One Nation leader herself. This was ugly, and thankfully there was no violence, no arrests, and no one was hurt. But a lot of people were inconvenienced, a lot of people were intimidated, and a lot of police resources were diverted from fighting crime. And in the end, this is a pretty puerile political push. I mean, have a listen to this. Yeah, these protesters are uniting to fight the right. They are the hard left, the feral left, if you like, and their main issue is just to fight the right, as if being right of centre, as if believing in small government, free enterprise, strong borders and personal responsibility, as if these things are something to protest against or to fight, as they say. So this is worrying enough, but my concern here is that the threats against Hanson and One Nation are even more serious because the police presence and posture was so robust, and this suggests that they might be worried about more than mere protesters. And this could be a major issue for this country. With Victoria effectively in campaign mode already and the New South Wales election happening early next year, and then the focus, of course, will switch to the looming federal election by then, How are we going to ensure that all politicians can campaign freely? Will one nation have to campaign the whole time from behind a force field of security? If so, what will that mean for the other parties? And more to the point, what does that mean for our democracy and our way of life? Now, peaceful protests, of course, are a crucial part of democracy, and violence, of course, is beyond the pale. But so too is intimidation. Intimidation that can curtail free political debate. We need to watch this space very carefully. It's time to call out the appalling hypocrisy of Anthony Albanese and his government on women. This stuff is so bad that it seems to encourage foul hatred directed at Conservative women, and it's even harming Australia's international diplomacy. The Prime Minister has demonstrably failed Australia's richest woman, Gina Rinehart, and the Japanese Prime Minister, Senai Takaichi, and in doing so, he's let down all women and our country. Let me explain. First up, Albanese constantly boasts that his government is focused on delivering for women.
But the truth is that if you look at the government and then what some see as the alternative government, my government has a majority of women in our caucus. We have a majority of women around our cabinet table.
Albanese has even gotten on his high horse accusing others of sexist behaviour.
And last week, The Nightly published a piece by Aaron Patrick under the headline, "Why I Wouldn't Marry Susan Lee." That headline is a disgrace, and the article is no better. I don't intend to quote from it any further. You really only need to know one thing about it. That article would never have been written about a male political leader. One of the lessons I would hope that this parliament and those who observe it have learnt from Julia Gillard's time as Prime Minister is that it is not enough to shake our heads at this stuff in private. As leaders, we have a responsibility to call it out, and today, as Prime Minister, I call it out.
Yet this is the same Prime Minister who said this while sitting in the lodge.
Shag, marry, date. Kylie Minogue?
Kylie, clearly.
You'd marry Kylie. And Shagger. And Data?
All of the above.
Just extraordinary, isn't it? But it gets much worse. Let me share the international embarrassment. It follows the Canberra visit in May by Japan's first female Prime Minister, Senai Takaichi. The visit went well, but it's what Albanese said afterwards that was so telling. This was all brilliantly dissected by Japanese journalist Waka Ikeda in a piece republished in the Weekend Australian. Ikeda writes that Takaichi brought her host a gift chosen with diplomatic care: crown melons from Shizuoka, the most prized fruit in Japan, to mark the reopening of Australian markets to Japanese melons. And she explained, in Japan, a crown melon can cost more than a fine bottle of wine. Its perfection, based on the Japanese artisan spirit of takumi, is what you bring when you wish to honour someone. Well, as you know, we got an insight into Albanese's character, judgment and hypocrisy when he spoke about this thoughtful gift weeks later.
The Japanese Prime Minister brought a melon.
Did she smuggle it?
I don't know.
Oh, I'm expecting...
Got a couple of melons.
She brought two.
She brought two, as you do.
She just came in looking like Pamela Anderson.
She brought two.
Yes, really.
And they're beautiful.
Your Prime Minister. How cringeworthy for Australia. But imagine how it looked to Japan and Takaichi. Ikeda writes, consider who was being laughed at. Takaichi is the first female Prime Minister in Japanese history and leads a country locked in its most dangerous confrontation with China in decades. This is the leader of Australia's closest security partner in Asia, and her state gift became a breast joke on a crude podcast. What a telling observation there made by female Japanese journalist Ikeda, who also wrote about how Takaichi, as a female trailblazer, has had to endure sexist attacks in politics and how, because she's a conservative, she hasn't been defended by the usual feminist advocates, just like here in Australia. And the point about Albanese's puerile sexism against Takaichi is that it drew so little criticism. The feminists in Australia were struck dumb. Our Prime Minister made crude schoolboy jokes about the first woman to run one of the most significant countries on the planet, diminishing not only her but her nation, and the usual defenders of women and international respect in politics and the media were silent. Yet just weeks ago, Albanese was on his high horse condemning others for daring to run a Ditch the Witch campaign against then Victorian Labor Premier Jacinta Allen.
Specifically, what worries me is the misogyny that's involved there. The sexist campaign targeting the Victorian Premier is totally unacceptable and has no place in public life. We want to encourage women to enter public life, and it should be a contest of ideas, not personal attacks.
This is the same man who joked about Takaichi's melons. How embarrassing for Albanese, how demeaning for Australia. As Akita writes, on recent evidence, a woman may run the world's fourth largest economy, stare down Beijing's threats, and still be reduced by an allied Prime Minister to 2 melons on a podcast. The joke was beneath him and beneath Australia, a long-time ally and friend of Japan. The silence that followed was beneath everyone. Yeah, that was a superb takedown of Albanese and the feminists of Australia who remain mute. But yet, it still gets worse for Albanese. We only have to look at the case of Gina Rinehart, subject to this vile abuse on the national broadcaster. Since this episode was brought to everyone's attention by my colleague Andrew Bolt, the filmmaker has offered a half apology, but the ABC has not. A couple of government ministers have said it was offensive and welcomed the ABC referring it to their internal ombudsman. But Albanese has said nothing, and none of his ministers has demanded that the ABC apologise. You can still view that horrible muck on the ABC's digital platforms. Rinehart is threatening legal action now. So as it stands, your tax dollars have paid for this filth. Your tax dollars are still paying for it to be available online. Your tax dollars are paying the ABC chairman, the board, the managing director and other executives while they refuse to apologise. And your tax dollars will also pay for any legal costs incurred by the ABC if they defend their right to broadcast this sort of offensive abuse. Look, as you know, you probably do know, I've got experience in this stuff. When the ABC called me a dog effer and mocked up a picture showing me up a dog, they refused to apologise. Thanks to my employer, I was able to take action and force them to apologise, and they wasted a lot of taxpayers' money along the way trying to defend their right to call me a dog effer. Now they seem to be repeating the exact same mistake with Gina Rinehart. They're again driven by their disdain for anyone right of centre. And you pay for it. We all know they'd never tolerate this, and nor should they if it was directed at a woman of the left. And my point about Albanese is this comes back to him and it lands on his desk. If Albanese was a leader and a fighter for the rights of women in public life, well, then the Prime Minister would fix this simply by speaking with some clear moral emphasis, some moral clarity, by demanding that the ABC apologise and lift its game. Instead, he just lets it run, and his government lets it run. Pure weakness. And as a result of this, partly, the ABC is in deep crisis again. Apart from the Gina Rinehart abomination, it's been banned from all One Nation media events, and it's being called out constantly for its anti-Israel bias in its reporting from the Middle East. And unbelievably, as you saw on this program, its chairman, Kim Williams, has flat out denied any issue of political bias at the public broadcaster. Now it's been caught out by its own media program for seemingly fabricating major current affairs stories. Media Watch last night further exposed the Four Corners reports that led to the sacking of former bikie turned reporter Mahmoud Fazal. Media Watch showed us how someone portrayed by Fazal as a major drug dealer was in large part an ABC invention, complete with an ABC-funded car.
Nice to finally meet you.
Pleasure. What does all of this mean to you? Rolling around in a car like this, living in a leafy North Shore suburb, considering how you grew up?
It means everything.
One claim she made in her video that we have been able to establish is she did not pay for this fancy car. The ABC did. So when the program put this to air,
I got us some nice wheels, a driver, take you a few spots around Sydney, tell you some stories, show you some things.
someone in the Four Corners team must have known the audience was being misled.
Yeah, your tax is hiring a fancy car to help make someone look like a successful drug dealer, and others at the ABC must have known. Still, another ABC program, this time radio, bought into this scam, and this time the connections went all the way back to the Media Watch team.
A day before Four Corners aired its episode, Radio National's long-running background briefing published an even more in-depth portrait of her life.
Started to network, go to the after-work drinks, hang out with the managing directors, meet their managing director friends. 10 grand a day, 40, 50 grand a week.
With the episode containing this disclaimer, which was not included in the Four Corners.
Stories like this are hard to verify, so we've taken steps where we can to make sure this one is accurate. But it's one person's story, her experiences, and her version of events.
The Remy profile was approved for broadcast by Background Briefing's executive producer Fanu Falali. Second in charge was Mario Christodoulou, who is now executive producer of Media Watch and who recused himself last week from all work on this story.
I bet he did. The ramifications for all this are serious.
There can now be little doubt that Mahmoud Fazal was, at the very least, embellishing his journalism and cheating his audience. The greater trouble, however, is the contagion has spread, and a serious breakdown in editorial integrity at not one, but two of the ABC's most respected and important programs has been exposed. His managers granting too much trust and too much autonomy to a journalist with a history of choosing life outside the rules.
What a mess. Well done to Media Watch. Still, at least the ABC took Fazal's stories down from their website. Sarah Ferguson's loopy three-part series on Four Corners, claiming that Vladimir Putin installed Donald Trump in the White House, is still available online at your expense, your tax dollars, as is that horrible attack on Gina Rinehart. And once more, it seems no one is in charge at the ABC. I want to return now to what I started the program on, and that is the heavy police presence around One Nation's events in Melbourne yesterday. I asked Victoria's Shadow Police Minister Brad Batten for his perspective.
Yeah, disappointing to see on the streets that we see that level of protests outside of political events. I'd say we've seen it in the past when we've had Liberal governments here in Victoria, when we have a group that want to get it out of control and they think that if they become violent or threaten violence, that they can get control. We just need to make sure that Victoria Police have the resources to make sure that doesn't happen. because it's a concern for all members of parliament. This isn't just a one party. Should be a concern to every member of parliament and to speech here in Victoria.
Yeah, my understanding is that One Nation were going to do their launch on the steps of Parliament House, but they were advised that that would be too much of a security risk. There were a lot of police around Parliament House yesterday too, so they moved it indoors. Therefore, of course, a less public event. So it's already had an impact on the way they're campaigning.
Yeah, it does. And we've seen this before. I know when we've tried to do things externally over time. And I know sometimes people get excited that they can get a group out there, and they do. Everyone's entitled to protest. Everyone's entitled to have their voice. But it's when it starts to become threats of violence against any political party, that's where I draw the line. Or even to organisations. We've seen it in Melbourne, that it's almost been okay to protest on certain things and not okay on others. And we saw it with when we had our display down here with the military, that all of a sudden we had protesters saying that it wasn't okay. But then if it was for other events, there seemed to be it was turned a blind eye, and I don't accept that.
I want to get back to how this is going to impact the Liberal opposition as well in the looming election campaign. But just on yesterday and last night, I went to the second event at Hawthorn. Police there had to lock down a couple of suburban streets so people couldn't get through there. Traffic was diverted around a whole block effectively. So two things about this worried me. One is it suggested that they might be worried about more than just protesters, because they were making sure that no cars were going either side on the roads of this suburban hotel. And secondly, it's the amount of police resources here. Victoria's dealing with massive crime problems, and here you have dozens of police and all sorts of vehicles and resources dedicated to protecting just a political fundraiser.
Yeah, we've seen this too often in Melbourne, and as I said, and it's become almost normal. The amount of police that we have to put to babysit those that want to protest or threaten violence in Victoria is ridiculous. We've already got 1,500 vacancies. We know we need to recruit more police, and we've promised to do that. We've seen 40 stations shut across the state. We've already said we'll reopen them. But now we're seeing more and more police. The amount of hours, it is tens of thousands of shifts that we lose each year to protesters here in Melbourne. That's why we'll make sure we have move-on laws, give the police the powers to ensure that they can keep areas safe, and it will use less resources longer term so we can send them back out where it's needed to stop the ag-burgs and to stop the assaults.
And Brad, of course, you want people to vote Liberal, but One Nation will be out there campaigning for votes as well. This is obviously going to hamper their campaigning if they have to campaign behind police barricades all the same. And you must be worried too. For Liberal and National MPs, it must be, and candidates, it's going to be difficult campaigning when there is this intimidation about.
Yeah, we've seen it in the past, and we get advice from police and security in relation to things we can and can't do. I don't want to go down the path we've seen overseas where you see violence against members of parliament, again, of any persuasion. And I think it's really important that we can go out and meet the people. But we also know, look, Jess Wilson went around to 88 seats in 36 days without any hassles, without any police escort, without any security issues. If you're out there with the right messaging, people tend to, and without being divisive, people tend to come up and want to chat to you and speak to you. I think it's important we also consider that when we're campaigning.
Yeah, great. Thanks for joining us, Brad. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Brad Batten there from the state opposition in Victoria. I want to welcome to the set now Shadow Education Minister federally, Julian Leeser. Good to talk to you, Julian. I just want to get your thoughts on that issue first, because I think it's very important for this country with elections and campaigning over the next couple of years. The level of security being required is actually looking like it could seriously retard free and open debate.
Chris, this is a fundamental attack on the freedom of association, which you require in a democracy to have free and fair elections. It's the same group of people on the far left all the time trying to disrupt our democracy. It's particularly bad in Victoria with its lax laws. But we see this in New South Wales too. We've seen at the Royal Commission today, issues around the police failing to move protesters on who are causing disturbances. I think we've got to stop trying to protect the peace and start protecting the peaceful. Yeah,
I think it's a real worry. I'm going to keep on this because we've got to stamp this stuff out early before it shuts down political campaigning. You're just back from Gama, the Gama Festival in the Northern Territory, looking at all sorts of Indigenous issues. I want to refresh people's memory, this promise made by Anthony Albanese at last year's Gama Festival.
I commit here that every single year that I have the great honour to be Australia's Prime Minister, I will be here and engaged with you.
He'll be there every year, Julian. He broke that promise the first opportunity he had to break it. He's been on leave over the weekend instead. How did that go down in Garma? Was he missed?
Well, Australians know they can't trust Albanese. He lies about energy policy. He lies about taxes. He lies about coming to the Indigenous festival Garma. There was lots of commentary about the fact that he wasn't there. And you can see the problem of him not showing up. Labor's Indigenous affairs policy has been adrift since The Voice. And that's why I was there, because I wanted to chart a new direction in Indigenous affairs focused on education, wealth creation and suicide prevention. That's a refreshing change from the government's torpor for the last 3 years.
Yeah, this is an important point because the Voice debate was won and lost, we know. But one thing, at least overtly, that everybody on both sides of the debate argued, and that is they're all interested in trying to get rid of Indigenous disadvantage, in closing the gap. After losing the Voice referendum, what has Labor done in that regard?
Well, they've not done anything, and what we've seen with the Closing the Gap data is effectively that there's been no real change in the last 5 years. I was critical of some of the Closing the Gap data because some of the information, we actually only get the information every 5 years rather than every year. But the key thing is, having raised these issues of Indigenous disadvantage in the referendum, the Prime Minister should have doubled down and said, right, we're going to really focus on 3 or 4 issues. So I've demonstrated the leadership that's been lacking by saying, here's 3 issues that I think aren't just key issues, but they're things that if you get right, they will have intergenerational benefits. If you get kids to school and complete school, if you encourage Indigenous people into business and make better use of their land, and if you deal with the scourge of Indigenous suicide, which is just, it goes up and up and up, every Closing the Gap report, we can't continue to just sweep it under the carpet.
All right, let's switch to politicking and the discussion about the coalition versus One Nation in electoral politics. There's all this focus, will there be a coalition, won't there be a coalition? I think both sides are saying there won't be a coalition, that's pretty clear. But there's a lot of ways that both One Nation and the coalition could support each other before an election and after an election without forming coalition. They can swap preferences, and then after an election they can support each other for supply and the like. Are you one of these people who believes that the coalition needs to look at how it can cooperate with One Nation, or are you in the camp where you need to fight One Nation like they're a key political enemy?
Chris, I'm in the camp of seeing the coalition win as many seats as possible and form government in its own right. That's what Australia needs now, given that we've got this terrible Albanese government that's lost control of the economy, run our country into the sand and divided us socially.
But is the way to win as many seats as possible to work at least in some seats with One Nation, or is the way to win more seats to fight against One Nation?
You know, I think the way to win as many seats as possible is to come up with policies that Australians will identify with. That's why I went to Garma and talked about practical things like getting Indigenous kids to school, like seeing them succeed in business, like dealing with suicide. It's why in education I talk about things like the Back to Basics curriculum and ensuring that people have deep discipline knowledge and that they have direct instruction in our classrooms. We have a curriculum that actually shows pride in our history. Those are the sorts of policies that I spend my time developing.
Pride in our history, perish the thought. Was there anyone from One Nation at Garma?
I don't think so.
Be interesting, but I think you might be right. We would have heard about it if they were. Thanks for joining us, Julian.
Thanks.
Julian Leeson there, the Shadow Education Minister federally. Coming up after the break, we ask the question whether the Muslim call to prayer should echo out across a Sydney suburb. There's been a fiery debate at Canterbury Bankstown Council in southwestern Sydney over plans to install loudspeakers at Lakemba Mosque to broadcast the call to prayer. Here's our News24 reported on details of the proposal.
The Lebanese Muslim Association proposed a $23,000 plan that would have 4 speakers broadcast the call to prayer every Friday for up to 15 minutes. The proposal was rejected last year after strong community opposition.
The application is still up in the air, but have a look at one councillor's suggestion for residents who are worried about the noise.
Well, if you're really annoyed about the bill or about the sound of it, close your windows. I'm glad to find it funny. That's excellent. But here we're talking about people and freedom of religion and how you can do it.
Just close your windows, hey? Let's bring in independent councillor Barbara Curry, who has campaigned against this proposal. Thanks for joining us, Barbara. Tell us why you're worried about these loudspeakers and why you think they're not the best thing for the suburb of Lakemba.
Well, first of all, Chris, there are 4 speakers that will be placed on top of the mosque at about 20.5 metres in height, north, south, east and west. And they will be, it's an amplified call to prayer, and they're fairly large pieces of equipment. And the Lebanese Muslim Association has said they're bringing down the noise from, I think it was 83 decibels last year in their application to 53 decibels. However, what the public does not know is that the pieces of equipment that they're intending on placing on top of the Lebanese mosque in Lakemba will go to up to 123 decibels, which is the sound of a rock concert or a jackhammer.
Well, this would
go higher than that.
Yeah, all right. So you're saying that they're pretty loud and they're going to carry a long way from that minaret tower. But would they do this 5 times a day on a Friday? Do they do it from dawn till sunset?
No, the proposal is, at the moment, for on a Friday at midday, call to prayer up to 15 minutes every Friday, at the moment.
See, this, I think, is an important point, because we all know that normally the call to prayer happens at sunrise, very early in the morning, and again at sunset. And if you travel in Muslim countries, you're used to that. Surely in the middle of the day, it's not much of a problem for anyone.
Well, it is. We have a lot of schools, we have churches, we have people that work shift work, we have childcare centres, we have nursing homes, and we have what they call, Chris, the right to the quiet enjoyment of your home. And we have the right to practice our religion in this country, but we do not have the right to create an amenity problem when we do practice our religion. When we practice our religion, we should be doing it in silence and not creating an amenity problem for our neighbours. What does the
mosque currently do for its call to prayer?
They have a gentleman that stands at the top of the stairs every Friday, and there is a call to prayer by that person, and it affects nobody. And that's what they've been doing from day one. The mosque has been there since 1977. And it's been very, very successful. There's been no necessity to have a call to prayer on an amplified, with such large pieces of equipment. I just don't understand it. Mr. Keir, the treasurer of the Lebanese Muslim Association, made a statement in the media a couple of weeks ago that this was not for the worshippers, this was for the greater community. And I would like Mr. Keir to explain what he means by that.
See, if the call to prayer has been happening for many, many years without amplification at that mosque, in that community, that's fine. Why the need to amplify it at least once a day? It's not going to alert anybody to the call to prayer. They'll know about that already, as you say. It is an interesting point that they're talking about actually changing the character of the suburb with that call to prayer on the Friday.
To me, Chris, it's sort of like a geopolitical dominance, and we can't have that in our local areas. I mean, we are a very multicultural community. We have up to 99 different nationalities that live in our area. We have, we have 41.7% of our population, which is Christian. We have 23.6%, which is practice Islam. We have Buddhists that are 6%, Hindu 2.1%, and there's 17.7%, which Mr. Keir does not understand, practice no religion. They are either identified as secular or other religions.
But for viewers, most of our viewers outside Sydney might not be familiar with the Lakemba. Apart from the mosque, of course, it's a very strongly Muslim area. There are a lot of Arabic signs and shops, so there are a lot of Muslims in that area. But you're saying there are many other people as well, of course.
Absolutely. And look, we've lived in harmony, peace and harmony in our area. I was born and bred in this area, and I've represented this area with great honour. This is my 4th term on the council. We were merged in 2016, and when the new council was elected in 2017, that's when all the problems started. And there's a real disconnect between Bankstown and Canterbury. The two councils were merged, and unfortunately, the persons that are making the comments about the call to prayer don't live in the area, never represented the old Canterbury area, which is where the mosque is.
Thanks for...
Canterbury... Sorry?
So, I'm sorry to cut you off, Barbara. You're just out of time. I appreciate that. Barbara Curry, councillor there from the Canterbury Bankstown Council. If the call to prayer has worked effectively all these years without amplification, you can understand why many people are resisting it right now. After the break, we're going to talk about the Bondi Royal Commission because it's heard police downplay that horrible Opera House disgrace and also seen a pro-Palestinian lawyer attack Israel. Alex Rivchin will join me next. The Bondi Royal Commission today examined that horrible protest at the Sydney Opera House on October the 9th, 2023. That is 2 days after 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered when Hamas and other terrorists invaded and attacked from Gaza, taking more than 250 hostages back with them. Yet at the Opera House, protests targeted Jews.
Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews?
Those scenes sickened people around the world and they heralded the start of more than 2 years of escalating anti-Semitism and Islamist extremism in this country, all the way up to the Bondi massacre last year and beyond. Yet listen to the New South Wales Police talk about the Opera House protest.
This protest has been one that we've spoken about for the last 3 years. I can understand the heightened emotions for someone watching that, thinking how bad that looks. We're talking hours of a protest that has been reduced to seconds or minutes on a news grab that has probably conflated it to make it more significant than what we would say it was. As far as public safety goes, I'm not talking about the intention behind it or how it might make the Jewish community feel, obviously.
It was pretty depressing to hear the police talk down this incident, as I discussed with Alex Rivchin from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry.
Yeah, it's disappointing and I'm not sure why the Deputy Commissioner is embarking on this path. I mean, we saw some horrific scenes there at the Opera House. We saw flares being lit and directed at police. We saw chants of, "Oh, Jews, the armies of Muhammad are coming." We heard the notorious chants directed towards the Jewish community. And to say that it was just seconds and has somehow been exaggerated, we saw at Bondi, within seconds, you can do immense damage. Within 20 seconds, 11 people were murdered, and it takes seconds to direct heinous threats against the community. So for the Commissioner to be downplaying it in that way, it's a curious choice. I'm not sure why he's doing it. And I hope he reconsiders what he's saying because it serves to downplay the severity of it and its implications, which were severe for the community.
Yeah, it seems to completely misunderstand what went on there as well, because firstly, this was supposed to be a night of mourning and memorial for the victims, and Jewish people could not go and do that because of this protest. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it was a direct threat. They were threatening Jewish Australians and intimidating them. And 2 years on, 3 years on, we can see what that led to.
And look, that moment was a critical moment in the history of this country, in the history of the last 3 years, which culminated in Bondi, of course, because that was the moment when the hatred that many felt towards the Jewish community was publicly expressed without severe condemnation, without sanction, without, real punishment for anybody. And then things escalated from there day by day and got progressively worse for the Jewish community. So, that's a moment that needs to be understood for its gravity. And to hear a senior police officer downplay it is really disappointing.
Well, you've got to let the Royal Commission run its course, but I would have thought leaders of the Jewish community would be greatly worried about the direction of police in the wake of those comments, because we know on that night there was a legal protest at the town hall in Sydney, but under the direction of police, those protesters were allowed to go to the Opera House, where they didn't have a permit to protest. There were no arrests made over those swearing and threats that were made at that protest. Jewish people were warned to stay away. As I mentioned before, it was a threat to Jewish Australians, and we saw that evolve into violence in the weeks and months afterwards, and then the horrific trauma of the Bondi massacre. For the police not to accept culpability on that night is deeply troubling.
And it's almost like an act of historical revisionism, because at the time the police owned the mistake, the government admitted that they got it wrong. There was an admission that they probably didn't understand the severity of these protests and the extremism of this movement. There was a belief that if they let off a bit of steam, it would kind of peter out and everything would return to normal. But what actually happened was these protests became an incubator for violent ideology, where week after week you heard incitement against the Jewish community, incitement against Zionists as being terrorists and supporters of genocide. You saw support for terrorist organisations, anti-Semitic slogans and chants. And this has been accepted by the government and by the police. So why are they now trying to almost walk that back and diminish the significance of that moment? That moment was extremely significant and poignant. And the fact that it wasn't stopped at that time had horrific repercussions for this society of ours.
I think you're right. I want to go to some more evidence before the Royal Commission today. And the person you're about to hear from here is a lawyer for the Australian Palestinian Action Network. In other words, this is a lawyer representing the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protesters. And remember, we are talking here about the October the 9th 2023 protest, the protest at the Opera House just 2 days after the atrocities in Israel.
And the context in relation to the events of 7 October 2023 are firstly that in the period between 2008 and 2023, 7 October 2023, roughly 6,600 Palestinians had been killed by the Israeli security forces. That's the context, is it not?
I mean, that's your assertion. I wasn't prepared for this. There's no way I can actually comment on that.
Mather, I don't think you're going to get very far with this line.
Yeah, thank God the Royal Commissioner shut her down there, but effectively you had a Palestinian advocate there dealing with anti-Semitism in Australia and effectively justifying the threats made against Australian Jews.
It's incredible. It's a justification of Australian anti-Semitism, and it's clearly an attempt to justify the atrocities of October 7. And the fact that a respected Jewish leader was pressed on this point, you know, they were trying to catch him out, but I think they revealed themselves, their pathology, their mentality, how they see Israel and Israeli lives, how they see the October 7 attacks, and effectively how they see everything that's been inflicted on the Jewish community in this country since. There is a context to October 7, and that context is more than 80 years of violent Palestinian rejection of Jewish self-determination and statehood, and embarking on terrorism to deny the Jewish people the right to live freely in their own land. That's the context. But the fact that this was put to a Jewish leader in a Royal Commission about Australian anti-Semitism and a slaughter at Bondi Beach, it's just preposterous, and I'm glad the Commissioner didn't allow it. But it's revealing also what we have to deal with in this country.
Thanks for joining us, Alex, in what was a pretty disheartening day at the Royal Commission.
Thank you, Chris.
We will get to a break now. On the other side, Susie O'Brien and Stephen Senatiempo will talk about a few things, including Qantas flying jobs overseas. Let's bring in the Tuesday panel with Susie O'Brien from the Herald Sun and News Corp National Education Editor, Stephen Senatiempo, breakfast host, 2CC, gets up early there in the nation's capital. Good to speak to both of you again. I want to talk about house prices. And, Susie, this is alarming, the stats showing just how far house prices are going backwards. And the latest news out today from NAB suggests it's going to be worse than people have been predicting. They're saying that in Melbourne and Sydney, house prices will go down 10% before they start to pick up again.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's one small group of maybe young home buyers that are going to benefit for prices dropping by about $100,000. Everyone else is going to get absolutely slogged. Developers who need confidence in the market, but even people who are buying houses are still holding off because they don't want to get stuck with negative equity. And that actually means, it doesn't mean that you don't have money to pay on your loan. It actually means that your house is worth less than you pay for it, and that's the big concern right now.
Yeah, it's a hell of a problem, a hell of a worry. People don't want to buy a depreciating asset, yet one of the front benches for Labor, Tanya Plibersek, had this to say on the weekend.
Not in my lifetime has there been a better time to be a first home buyer in Australia.
Yeah, I think that might have been yesterday, but Stephen, how about that? She says get out there and buy.
It's the delusion from government ministers. I think it was Richard Marles or Mark Butler that said today, look, it's not as bad as everybody thinks it is. Look, the reality is that if you're a first home buyer trying to get into the market, at some point when it bottoms out, it'll be a great time to get in. But if you bought in the last 10 years, you're going to take a massive hit. If you bought 30, 40 years ago, well, it's probably not going to make that much difference to you overall. But the government, I know they want to make it easier. Well, they say they want to make it easier for first home buyers to get into the market, but first home buyers are abandoning the market as well. Yep. Investors are abandoning. Everybody is getting out of the market. This is having the absolute opposite effect to what they tell us they want. But one wonders whether there's the cynic in me says maybe this is what they wanted.
Well, yeah, if that's so, they don't understand the way the country works because it's going to be a real worry. Think about people who signed off on a loan today. They're going to immediately see their asset depreciate over the coming months, and that is not a good feeling. We all know that if you can keep up the payments and ride it out, then years down the track you're going to be sitting pretty. But it's a horrible feeling when you do owe more than the property is worth, and you know if you lose your job or something goes wrong, you're absolutely stuck. So let's hope it doesn't get that bad for too many people. I want to move on to Qantas, Susie, and this is a revealing story, isn't it? There's been a lot of focus on Qantas because Alan Joyce has got a book out. But the idea that to cut costs and using AI and whatever, they can ship a whole lot more back office jobs to India. I don't think this is the way people want the national airline operating.
Yeah, you feel like the standards should be higher for our national airline. I was actually in Adelaide Airport on the weekend and noticed Alan Joyce's memoirs is already cut price by $10. It looks like no one's buying it, funnily enough. My friends and I were all saying, who'd buy that book? And look, Qantas does have a pretty dubious record in terms of the way that it's treated staff, particularly through COVID, not to mention its customers. So you would like to think that it has learned something under the new CEO, but time will tell. Certainly these signs are not good.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be picking that book up. And I've got to complain about... I was on a Qantas flight this morning, actually, and I think they've dropped the quiz from their magazine. What's the point of the magazine if you don't have a quiz in it? But well, I'll take that up with them another time. Hey, I want to go to this footage, Steve, and get your thoughts on this. A nurse in Brisbane was dealing with a violent patient. It's horrible that nurses at hospitals so often have to put up with these incidents. But a bit of jiu-jitsu came in handy here as the nurse was able to restrain this person without doing too much damage.
Yeah, look, it's shocking when you see the level of violence that's being directed towards medical staff these days. I mean, we hear about it here on a weekly basis in the ACT, and it's probably worse here than anywhere else. But, I mean, great that this bloke had a bit of martial arts knowledge, but he shouldn't have to. There's got to be some better way to manage our, particularly in the environment now where everybody seems so amped up and people are just so aggressive. We need to be able to protect our frontline workers. There should have been security in that building so that a bloke in scrubs doesn't have to tackle a bloke that's being aggressive. It's just, we need to do more to protect people like the guy that protected himself. Yeah, exactly. It is a bit of a worry. I want to finish on the Royals. This story, suddenly, I'm not very interested in royal stories, as you know, but suddenly this has got me interested, the idea of Harry returning to the fold. Now, his father, the King, King Charles, apparently wants to welcome him back, Susie. I understand that. The prodigal son, you don't care what he's done or said, you want your son back, welcome him back. But apparently his brother, Prince William, of course, the heir apparent,
he's very wary about this because he's worried it will damage the royal brand. I mean, this is a bloke who has accused the royals of being racist, for instance. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think Prince William has always said that racist comment was what really stuck with him. He really hated it, and of course the poor relationship between Meghan and Kate. But you can understand I was going to say Prince Charles.
Yes.
You can understand the King wanting to make up with his son. He's got cancer. He's not that well. You know, you can imagine that he just wants to have some sort of reuniting, but it's not going to be completely through the whole family. Prince William does not want a bar of it.
Only 10 seconds, Stephen, welcome him back, but make sure he apologises, right?
Yeah, I think so. But having said that, the King's clearly aware of his mortality, and he's got a lot more class than the Duke of Montecito does.
Thanks for joining us, Stephen and Susie. We'll catch you next week. It's now time for Peter Credlin. I'll see you tomorrow.